The Pascagoula Abduction Incident. At 11 p.m. on October 11, 1973, two men burst into the police station of the small town of Pascagoula, Mississippi. They were visibly shaken and speaking incoherently. The older of the two muttered to himself, "America. America is about to be fully invaded." Who? Who would dare to invade America? Who were the invaders? The police officers immediately gathered around. "We were abducted by aliens." The two men were quickly taken into a small room, where they recounted a bizarre story of being kidnapped by unknown beings. Even more astonishing was that the police actually believed them. 2 years later, one of the officers who received their report, Glenn Ryder, confidently told the Washington Post that he was certain the two men weren't lying. So, what kind of story did they tell? And how did they convince the police? Let's first take a look at their abduction experience. The abduction story. The two men were 42-year-old Charles Hickson and 18-year-old Calvin Parker, both working at a local shipyard. After work that day, they went fishing at an abandoned shipyard nearby. At around 9 p.m., they suddenly heard a strange buzzing sound coming from behind them. Puzzled, they turned around, only to see something they had never encountered before. First, they noticed a blue light. Then, emerging from the light, a massive football-shaped object about the size of a large truck, with a gray dome. The craft hovered about 30 meters away from them, floating less than a meter above the ground. Suddenly, three small gray beings, about 1.5 meters tall, drifted out of the craft. They were hideous, gray skin covered in wrinkles, no necks, tiny ears, small pointed noses, and eyes and mouths that appeared as thin slits. Their fingers resembled crab claws, and they had no toes. Their legs were fused together, resembling a mermaid's tail, and their skin looked rough, like an elephant's. One of the small gray beings floated quickly toward young Parker and touched him. Parker later said he was so terrified that he fainted. The rest of the story was recounted solely by Hickson. He said the other two small gray beings swiftly floated toward him and grabbed him. Instinctively, he wanted to resist. Hickson had been a soldier, had fought in combat, and knew karate. He was not easily overpowered. But before he could react, he felt a sharp pain in his left arm, followed by complete numbness. His entire body became paralyzed. The two beings carried him into the craft. As soon as he entered, he experienced a feeling of weightlessness. Inside, the spacecraft was brightly lit, but he couldn't see where the light was coming from. Hickson was left floating in midair, only able to move his eyes. Then, a floating eye, about the size of a football, emerged from the wall and began scanning his body, moving up and down, left and right. When the scan was complete, the eye disappeared back into the wall. The small gray beings stood silently around him. Overwhelmed, Hickson finally shouted, "Who are you? What do you want?" The beings seemed to respond, but all Hickson heard was a buzzing sound. He couldn't understand them. After that, his memory went blank. When he regained consciousness, the football-shaped craft had vanished. He found himself lying on the ground near the same fishing pier. Parker stood a short distance away, staring blankly as if his soul had left his body. Struggling to their feet, they returned to their car, trying to decide what to do. Hickson drank heavily to calm his nerves, while Parker just sat there and cried. Reporting the incident. Since the 1947 Roswell UFO crash, America had been obsessed with UFOs, with frequent reports appearing in newspapers and magazines. After gathering his thoughts, Hickson concluded that they had likely encountered extraterrestrials. They decided to report the incident to the military. There was an Air Force base nearby, so they called, but the base declined to handle such cases and hung up. Stunned, they considered contacting a newspaper. However, when they arrived at the office, the security guard told them that reporters wouldn't be in until the morning. If it's important, come back tomorrow. By then, it was nearly 11 p.m. In the end, they decided to go to the police station, leading to their dramatic entrance. The police investigation and hidden tape recorder. The officers who listened to their story that night were Sheriff Fred Diamond and Officer Glenn Ryder. After hearing them out, the officers stepped out of the room, leaving Hickson and Parker alone. Unbeknownst to the two men, the interrogation room had a hidden tape recorder running. As soon as they were alone, they began discussing the encounter again. Parker said he had been completely paralyzed and unable to move. Hickson said, "I always knew they were from another world. I just never thought it would happen to me." The police officers later listened to the recording. Based on their years of investigative experience, they felt the two men were not lying. The level of terror in their voices was too real. If they were acting, they should be in Hollywood, not working in a remote shipyard. Additionally, when speaking privately, their story remained consistent, with added details about the craft and the aliens. If they had fabricated the story, it was incredibly well crafted. If this was real, it was a huge deal. Could extraterrestrials really be invading Earth? The police quickly escalated the case. Within days, it became headline news worldwide. The recording later became one of the key pieces of evidence supporting the authenticity of the abduction. Additional evidence. Less than 36 hours after the incident, two prominent UFO researchers arrived: Dr. Alan Hynek, a military consultant, and Professor James Harder, from the University of California. Hickson and Parker easily passed polygraph tests, underwent hypnosis, and even consented to medical examinations. Years later, British UFO researcher Philip Mantell discovered another piece of evidence: the medical examination report. Written by Professor Harder, it detailed how Hickson had 3 puncture wounds on his left arm, while Parker had an injury on the sole of his left foot. The report even included photographs of their wounds, proof that neither man knew existed. This report significantly bolstered the credibility of their claims. Other witnesses. Initially, no other witnesses had come forward, which skeptics used to argue that the case was fabricated. However, in 1981, 8 years later, Reverend Emmanuel Pascagoula broke his silence. On the night of the abduction, he was driving near the fishing pier with a police officer and a young girl, when they noticed a cylindrical craft following their car. At first, they thought it was a military helicopter, but it mimicked their speed precisely, never overtaking them. Just as their fear grew, the object suddenly changed direction, toward the fishing pier where Hickson and Parker had been. Later, more witnesses, including a retired soldier and local residents, came forward to confirm they had seen a glowing craft that night. A historical marker. On June 22, 2019, the Pascagoula city government erected a historical marker at the fishing pier where the incident occurred, detailing the events of that night, essentially an official recognition of the case. Aftermath. The aliens return. In February 1974, while hunting alone in the woods, Hickson claimed he received a telepathic message from the aliens. "Tell people we mean no harm. You have been chosen. There is no need to fear." Later that May, a UFO reportedly followed his car, hovering 50 meters above it. His terrified wife screamed, but the craft eventually left without taking him. Hickson later claimed that a mysterious mole under his right eye was an alien implant used to track him. Parker's experience was even stranger. Follow-up story, alien return visit. One day in February 1974, Hickson was hunting alone in the forest when he suddenly received a telepathic message from the aliens. They said, "Tell people we have no intention of harming you. You have been chosen, and there is no need to be afraid." In May of that year, a UFO actually followed his car, hovering about 50 meters above it. Hickson's wife was so terrified that she started screaming. Fortunately, this time, the aliens did not take Hickson away. They simply circled a few times before leaving. Later, during an interview, Hickson mentioned that he had a mole-like mark under his right eye. He had visited several hospitals, but no doctor could determine what it was made of. However, He believed it was an implant from the aliens used to track him. Parker's experience was even more bizarre. At the time of Hickson's abduction, Parker did not actually lose consciousness. He too was taken aboard the UFO, stripped naked, and subjected to a medical examination. He felt deeply humiliated by the experience and refused to talk about it for years. 19 years later, the aliens visited him again. This time, he was received by an alien who appeared to be female. She told him that the beings who had abducted them before were merely 3 robots. She was the real extraterrestrial. She explained that their species shared the same God as humans, and that everything in the Bible was true. Their home planet had been destroyed, so they had come to Earth in hopes of coexisting with humans. They had actually arrived on Earth millions of years ago. At that time, humans had built a highly advanced civilization and constructed the pyramids. However, their morality was lacking, and eventually, that civilization was destroyed. Now, the Earth's civilization is once again on the verge of destruction. The aliens want Parker to deliver a message. Tell humanity to cherish their planet. That's the end of today's story. So, what do you think? Was this alien abduction real or fake?
Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Share it, because some stories are meant to be discovered together. And stay curious. I'll see you in the next chapter.